Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our webinar titled Hydrologic Response Units, Practical Ways to Incorporate Stormwater into Regional and Local Planning, brought to you by the Cape Cod Commission. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be managing logistics for today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce and provide you all with a little background about the SNEP Network. The SNEP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through the management of stormwater and restoration projects. The SNEP Network focuses on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, snepnetwork.org. And before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a Q&A session. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. And on that note, I'd like to hand over and introduce you to Tim with the Cape Cod Commission. Thanks, Tim.
All right, thanks, Leah. I'm going to share my screen here in just a second. All right, and it looks like we're going. So thanks everyone for joining us this morning for our webinar on, this is our second webinar on hydrologic response units. And really what we want to, talk about today, show a number of different examples of, an idea that I've been trying to promote over the span of the last 5+ years of taking our stormwater work and not just having it within kind of a stormwater bubble, but moving it into other areas of planning, and how these hydrologic response units are a really nice way to do that. And so if I can, there we go. If I can get these slides to advance very quickly, what we're going to do today. Again, this is our second webinar on hydrologic response units. There have also been a couple of very recent webinars on hydrologic response units. So I'm guessing most of the attendees today are familiar, but we will do a brief refresher in case anyone hasn't spent a lot of time in the HRU world already. We'll talk about a couple of different planning examples where we at the Cape Cod Commission have used these HRUs kind of now that we have them. And then we'll start to explore some other ideas on how we can use this resource in the future. And your panelists today, myself, I'm Tim Pascacarnis, Water Resources Analyst with Cape Cod Commission. I'm joined by the other half of the Water Resources Department, Tara Nye Lewis, same title, same place. We also have our fantastic GIS staff on with us today as well. They did a lot of the heavy lifting in the background for this. So if anybody puts zingers into the Q&A section, which I hope you do, we have them on standby to answer the hard questions for us and make us look good. All right, and I just wanted to give a little background kind of to this whole project and sort of how we ended up where we are. So Cape Cod Commission, we're a partner on the SNEP network, which Leah described in the introduction. And the SNEP network is entering kind of the first year of the second 5-year phase of kind of operations. And just about throughout that entire time period, this idea of hydrologic response units as a tool that we can use for stormwater planning has been an ongoing component of it. So if you look kind of at the left side of this timeline, we came up with this initial scope for doing HRUs on Cape Cod, back in 2020, which was around, it was kind of at the beginning of year 2 of the SNEP network, and did a lot of work, sort of figuring out like the mechanics of how are we going to do this, and that took, you can see on the timeline, that took a couple of years to get that together to the point where we sort of had the resource created and we created a story map. We gave a webinar on it. Um, but what's really cool about this project and about just the SNEP network, sort of the longer term model to it, that it comes in these 5-year chunks. It's not a sort of 1 or 2 year grant and you do your stuff and then you're done with it, is that you can see this work has continued to evolve throughout that whole first 5-year phase of the SNEP network. And obviously here we are just beginning kind of year one of the second 5 years, or year six. And we keep adding to it. So that's what's really neat about this, is we're never presenting really a finished product. It's always evolving, and that's kind of what you're going to get more of today, is you're going to see what we've done, but we're also looking for feedback on how we can continue to take this resource and make it better and make it more accessible. All right, so we'll try and get through this very quickly, but a refresher on HRUs, or hydrologic response units, right? So we're kind of talking here about stormwater runoff and kind of what characteristics of the land are going to impact, how runoff is generated and what's in that runoff. And the big factors are, right, your soil type, so what's happening under the ground, and then your land use and land cover, what's happening on top of the ground. Those are all going to kind of impact how a given land area, one, like how much runoff is going to be generated from, say, a particular storm, right? The volume of actual runoff versus what's going to infiltrate or percolate into the ground. And then, of course, what's going to be in that runoff? What sorts of nutrients might be transported by it? How much sediment, etc. So those are all things that you want to think about, right? If you are, if you're doing any sort of stormwater planning, or, as we're going to get into later today, any sort of resource planning that might be impacted by stormwater and stormwater runoff. So if you were to go about kind of considering those different factors in a very like straightforward and mathematical way, right? You would just start combining them. You would say, okay, I'm going to take all my unique options for land cover, land use, soil type, and also the slope of the land. And I will note here that this is because we did this on Cape Cod. We're in Massachusetts, obviously. So these are based on the Mass GIS land use land cover data set and the categories. If anyone attended the recent webinars that EPA and Horsley Witten and FB Environmental did, you'll note that things are a little bit different in Rhode Island. So just want to make that distinction now, that these numbers are particular to Massachusetts, but they're similar as you sort of go throughout the rest of the SNEP region. Point being, if you just do that, sort of do all the combinations, right, you get almost 7,000 results. And imagine if you tried to map that, you'd need 7,000 different colors. It would be impossible to make sense of. So this is where hydrologic response units, or HRUs, and I'll stick with that. I'll stick with that acronym probably for the rest of the webinar, just to to be more efficient with our time. They sort of lump together combinations that are going to respond in a similar fashion. And if you take the kind of crosswalks that were developed through EPA, through the MS4 permit, through a lot of work that preceded anything that we did, you can condense those 7,000 results down to a much more manageable number of about 14, which are kind of divided up into different combinations of pervious and impervious surfaces, and different types of developed and undeveloped land use, land cover combinations. And that's really important, right? Because, like, yeah, it's great that we can sort of condense all this land down into, 14 categories. But those categories themselves aren't really, super illuminating. It's the fact that each of those categories then has all of these things attached to it. So an estimated runoff volume, in sort of a volume per year, and estimated loading rates for things like nitrogen, phosphorus, suspended solids, and metals. And so that's where really you can take these HRUs and you can apply them to, some other sort of planning where you might be concerned about, one of these things specifically or a couple of these. And you want to know, either how to prioritize or how to find areas where some sort of management might make sense. And we'll just show, because this is another area where our analysis is a little bit different from the analysis that was recently done for the larger SNEP region. So when we did our HRU calculations for Barnstable County, we worked with a grid system. So we divided the whole land mass up into basically 10 meter by 10 meter grid cells, and then determined an HRU class for each of those, and then attached all of those different things, runoff volumes, nutrient loadings, etc. And we did this because we wanted to be able to sort of do mathematical operations on them in the future. And a couple of years ago, when we were developing this data resource and looking forward to tools from it, that seemed like the most practical way to do it. But that is different from the way that the SNEP region HRU mapping was done. And so that's something that we're going to look to the future to figure out is how kind of similar operations to what we're going to show you today can be done with that regional resource. But again, one of the challenges with that is just for Barnstable County, we end up with 10.5 million of those individual grid cells. So you can imagine if you tried to do that throughout the entire SNEP region, it would be a much bigger number than that, which can present kind of some computational and computer processing challenges. So that's always one of the balances here too, right? Is being able to have a resource that, you can do analysis with, and it can be fairly accurate, but it also has to be something you can actually do without, having a supercomputing center at your disposal. So hopefully that reminds everybody kind of the concept of HRUs and, what they can be used for. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tara, and she'll start to talk about, some of the things that we've actually used them for.
Thanks, Tim. So there are a number of different lenses through which stormwater and stormwater management can be viewed. Excuse me. One perspective, kind of an obvious one, is transportation. Mainly for safety. Managing stormwater on and around roads is really important. So every 4 years, the Cape Cod Commission updates the regional transportation plan. This establishes spending priorities for transportation infrastructure on Cape Cod. As part of this plan, there is a stormwater management appendix that also gets updated. And this past update includes additional information generated from this the HRU tool. Excuse me. So this is an example of one use HRU was used for actual project and implementation of projects. As we all know, the impacts of increased impervious cover result in greater volume and peak flows of runoff and an increase in runoff carrying contaminants into water bodies. Considering that second issue, impacts to water bodies, we conducted an analysis in GIS using HRUs to look at the potential impacts roads have on ponds, specifically runoff from the road carrying phosphorus into ponds, because phosphorus is typically the limiting nutrient in a freshwater body. So the process we used, next slide, Tim, to generate hotspots is detailed, albeit very much simplified, but in these slides. Here we have a pond represented by the blue polygons, and we identified road segments around those ponds. Those are the gray lines around the ponds. And then we established a buffer. And in this case, for this project, we used a 100-foot buffer. Where the road segments were inside that 100-foot buffer, we generated HRUs. Next slide, please. So this is the intersection of that, the 100-foot buffer around the pond with the roads that are within that 100-foot buffer. And so we generated HRUs for this intersection. Next slide. And we used those with 99% confidence as our hotspots. So that red area at the top there is showing where our hotspots are for within the 100-foot buffer to this pond. And hotspots are essentially where the road HRUs are. So then we wanted to scale this up to a regional level because this whole project was to be used, is used in the newly updated regional transportation plan, which is a regional plan. So now the information has been incorporated, included in the regional transportation plan for future road projects. Next slide, please. You can see here the network. So this is the Cape-wide HRU hotspots. And you can see the network of roads across Cape Cod. This map shows major and collector roads, and the red spots are the phosphorus hotspots. And although the ponds don't pop here, I mean, this was for transportation, so the pond locations aren't necessarily that important. You can, understand that where these red hotspots are is where the roads are within 100 feet of the pond. This application of the HRU tool needed, as Tim mentioned earlier, expertise of our GIS department. And this isn't something that I could have done by myself. And we understand that not everyone has access to a team of GIS experts. And so Tim is going to show how, with our new stormwater impact tool, any person without mad GIS skills could do a similar type of analysis.
All right, thanks, Tara. And yeah, that's a really cool example, like, because this data layer gets down to such a fine level. Like, if you've got the software and the skills to do it, you can get super granular with this stuff. You can zoom in to like these crazy small levels. But at the same time, we wanted to also try and make this this resource accessible without needing an ArcGIS Pro license and without needing a bunch of background to do that. And so to that end, this was this was like the third iteration in terms of the Cape Cod Commission's kind of HRU project, which was developing this online tool, the Stormwater Impacts tool, that again has some kind of the background on HRUs, but then it has a calculator built into it. So that's that kind of icon on the lower right. And this is what the Stormwater Impacts tool looks like. It's kind of a fairly Spartan interface. It's very utilitarian. But this is really kind of a proof of concept thing that we did, which was to say, hey, can we take this, this 10.5 million grid cell HRU layer, can we host it online? And then can we start to do some of those operations, that math that we were talking about, in like an online interface that you can just pop onto the website and do. And so I want to point out a couple things. Like I said, it's a little bit bare bones, but we do have some tips on navigation, on the different types of selections that you can make and how to do that in the lower left. So there are some kind of walkthroughs for anyone who does explore that. And then there are also a number of different ways that you can interact with this HRU data. You can choose kind of the way that you want to draw or select shapes to do things on. And I'm going to go through kind of all those different options in the future, but that's kind of the interface in the upper left where you will make those decisions. So there are a couple of pre-built geometries that you can take advantage of. So that's this filter type selecting features from data source. And if you choose that, then you have a couple options like pond watersheds and pond buffers. There's also another option in that filter type called drawn graphic, and that lets you pretty much, do whatever you want. You can see there are a couple different, options below that filter type drop down. You can make lines and line segments. You can choose points. You can create polygons, and then you can also add buffers to those shapes. And so this was us sort of trying to think about use cases and then take some fairly standard GIS tools and adapt them to those use cases. So for instance, if you wanted to look at road segments in a kind of similar way to what Tara just described, you can draw line segments. You can add a buffer to those line segments. And so what we're showing on the screen here is basically a chunk of road that's been selected. It's kind of 3 segments creating this, I don't know what you want to call it, half a hexagon, something like that, with a 200-foot buffer applied to it. So that's grabbing your line segment and then 200 feet on either side. And what it spits out in this kind of center pane then is basically the sum of all of those HRU units that are captured by your shape and the buffer. So it gives you the area that's captured, the estimated runoff from that, and then all of those other associated loadings with it. And so this, again, you're not going to be able to get the same the same level of analysis or detail that you would in a desktop GIS product. But one of the ways that these tools that we create that can be kind of basic, you can do more complicated analysis with them by sort of picking and choosing and then comparing your results, right? So you could, if you wanted to compare different road segments, you could say highlight just one of these 3, and you could see what the results are kind of down in the center, and then you could highlight another one. And so you can think about how you can use this in kind of a quick and easy way to compare things in apples to apples terms, which, going back to the original thought for generating hydrologic response units for the entire county, for the SNEP region, right, is to give everyone kind of a common starting place so that you can compare a road segment to a road segment, a pond to a pond, whatever 2 resources you might want to look at. You can look at them the same way throughout your town, across towns, within a watershed, all of those sorts of things. So that's where this gets neat, is we tried to, think of some cases that you might use this, give you the ability to, or the flexibility to do those things. But really then it's kind of up to users to explore and figure out, how can I take this and what questions do I want to answer? And can I do that with this particular, this tool and these resources? So I will leave it there for the stormwater impacts tool intro and kind of the road segment part of things. I'll turn it back over to Tara and we'll talk about doing some water resources planning.
Yeah, so we're not always necessarily doing stormwater planning, but we keep finding that this HRU information is incredibly useful for a number of other different perspectives. For example, water resources, water quality. From this perspective, the focus is namely protecting our valuable water resources, such as lakes and ponds. As part of our freshwater initiative, which is a science-based planning process to protect and restore Cape Cod's freshwater ponds, we did a region-wide update, taking advantage of new information, new data, new technology, including GIS. And we developed this Pond Atlas viewer, next slide, Tim, which has information for every pond, things like, this is the Pond Atlas viewer, and you can see the blue polygons are pretty obviously ponds. And so if you click on one of these ponds, it'll an information box pops up and it tells you the pond name, the town it's located in, the pond depth, the pond area, if it's a great pond or not, if the pond is stocked with fish, if it's near a cranberry bog, if it has or the amount of % of open space. So along those lines, it shows land cover and land use around the pond. And so we were looking at this and it occurred to us that with all these features and characteristics of ponds and pond watersheds, that maybe we could look to see if there are any connections between these features, these activities on the land, and water quality of the ponds adjacent. So for example, is there a connection between the amount of impervious cover and water quality? Does septic density have an impact on nearby pond water quality? Unfortunately, we weren't able to find any connections. Not to say that there aren't any correlations or connections, it's more likely because we didn't have enough data or the right kind of data at the time we did this to make those connections. And this was started about 3 years ago. So we did a little bit of a pivot at that time and decided instead, looking at this pond viewer, we have all of this information around these ponds, these factors or stressors that may impair a pond's water quality. So for each pond on Cape Cod, we identified all of these stressors in the pond, around the pond, in the pond watershed, and we assigned each of these stressors a score. And then we identified, we assigned them all each a score, and then we summed them up. And so we ended up with what we're calling a cumulative stress score for each pond. And actually, Tim, can you go to the next slide? And so here you can see our cumulative stress score ranked from 1 to 20, and we binned them. So we have 1 to 5 minimally stressed ponds that are in that small, darker blue. And then we have 6 to 10 cumulative stress score, and those are some stress to those ponds. And then 11 to 15, a cumulative stress score, just our generic stressed ponds. And then if the pond cumulative stress score was from 16 to 20, we considered those highly stressed ponds. And you can see on the left a list of the stressors. So we're talking about things I was referring in the other image, the other map, adjacency to cranberry bog, adjacency to golf courses, the depth of the pond, the volume, whether or not there's a centralized sewer system in the neighborhood. And then we also were looking at, next slide, Tim, I'm going to highlight the last 3 stressors, which are phosphorus load, nitrogen load, and total suspended solids. These are the stressors that were added to the cumulative stress score that we had generated from the HRU tool. And so, yeah, thanks. So this is actually a map, an interactive web-based map. It hasn't quite gone live yet. So this is sort of a preview into a project that we're doing. And you can see that the layers here include stress score, the 1 through 20, and broken down into those different bins. We also have impervious cover. We have the phosphorus hotspots in yellow. We have pond buffer. We have a 100-foot pond buffer in the blue around the pond. And then we also added a 300-foot buffer, which is the dotted lines around the ponds. I just wanted to point out that the impervious cover layer was used from planimetrics. And planimetrics includes things that I don't necessarily consider or think of as impervious, like dirt or gravel. And so this layer is clickable. If you click on any of these individual impervious cover polygons, a pop-up box tells you the use and material, for example, asphalt street or dirt walking path. And then also, if you click on any of the ponds, as you're seeing now in this image, another pop-up box shows you the name of the pond and a total cumulative stress score. So for this pond, Garrett's Pond in Barnstable, the total cumulative stress score was 11. And it also breaks down the stressors or criteria that were used to generate that total score. It tells you what that result was, yes or no, and then also the score. And so we added those up and we had this cumulative stress score here. Now that we have more water quality data available, the next step will be to compare these stress scores with our pond water quality. It has not been done yet, so stay tuned. We'll have that information hopefully relatively soon. And then also you can tweeze out, go to the next slide, Tim. You can tweeze out the phosphorus loading hotspots for individual ponds. And this map can be used to locate easy to implement stormwater management projects that could go a long way towards improving a pond's health. And again, I'll just mention that both of these projects were GIS that required our GIS department. I would not have been able to do them myself. And so a lot of the credit for these goes to Ann and Debbie for helping us out with those. And then again, I'm going to pass it off to Tim to talk about how the stormwater impacts tool can be used for those of you who don't have the GIS access.
All right, thanks again, Tara. Yeah, so getting back into the tool, and these were, these were the work that Tara just described and what went into the tool, we're not really like one followed the other. Both of them, we were sort of thinking about how do we want to use this? How can we build it into the tool? And then, also, how can we utilize it within a GIS environment to help these other projects that we're working on? And so because we've been in the midst of this freshwater initiative for several years now, and much of our focus has been on the freshwater ponds. We've been looking at different different ways that land around ponds, contributes to them, positively or negatively, to what's going on within the pond. And so we had a lot of kind of discussion and debate about what are the appropriate areas to be looking at for different contributors. So one of the sort of units of analysis that we landed on was this pond buffer, which you've seen throughout pretty much every one of these examples we've given. And that 100-foot buffer, we're treating as the area where contributions via surface runoff are likely. So, again, we're thinking about stormwater, we're thinking about, what's gonna contribute directly via surface runoff. And so that in the stormwater impacts tool, that's one of the pre-existing geometries that you can use, is you can select the buffer to all of the ponds that we have in our ponds layer, and you can find out, you can get all of those HRU results for the pond buffer. Pond buffer, we affectionately, refer to as the pond donut because that's often the shape of it. So, just to make sure everyone's still awake, this is the pond donut around the donut pond. So it's a donut squared. But, again, there are also, if we think about other, other ways that things can get into ponds or other areas that we might be interested in. On Cape Cod, the pond watersheds are actually determined by groundwater. So that might be, if we have folks visiting from elsewhere in the SNEP region, that might be a little different from what you think of as watersheds. And so we look at watersheds not so much for things like phosphorus that we might get through stormwater, but we do look at them for things that are transported through groundwater, like nitrogen. But if you're elsewhere, where surface flow is more dominant, this is something that you might think about looking at, is where you have catchment areas or watersheds. And really the point here being that these are just a couple examples, right? So since this is a gridded geospatial data layer, you can really take any kind of GIS shapes, delineations, however you want to carve things up, and do the same sorts of operations on them, kind of sum things by a particular area, compare things from area to area. So these are just the buffers, the watersheds. Those were kind of initial ideas that we thought might be important for us that we built in, but there's nothing special about them. You can use, any other shapes. You can also use within the tool. Oh, I jumped the gun on that. One of the things that I did want to point out here is how you can use these results to compare things, right? So certainly you can take this information in the middle pane, kind of copy it down and say, what did I get for this watershed? I got 163 pounds of phosphorus. Maybe I want to look at some other pond's watershed and compare them, etc. You can also, in the upper left, you can see all of those little 10 by 10 grid cells that you've selected here with, in this case, a pond watershed. You can export them. You can export them as a CSV or a bunch of other formats. I don't know if anyone kind of wants to get to that level of detail. You can see at 1,000 per page, there's 33 pages. So for this particular example, you'll get 33,000 grid cells. Do you want that so that you can kind of, sort them and do stuff with them? I don't know, but if so, you can. But it's just to say that, this is a super versatile resource that even in this kind of web tool context, you can get down to a pretty crazy level of detail with. Um, but what I wanted to say is that, again, we still don't know, but definitely when we were developing this, we didn't know what all the kind of, areas that you might want to select by might be. So within the tool, you can draw polygons of whatever shape you want. In this case, I decided I was going to grab a golf course, or, I was going to draw something that looks a little bit like a dinosaur. You figure out which one it is. But again, the point being that because of the way that this layer was constructed, you really have freedom to kind of lasso things however you want, and start to, either look at them kind of on an individual basis or compare things. So that's kind of where we're at in this ongoing evolution of, what can we do with this resource? How can we make it easier for us to use, certainly, but also how can we make it easier for people who are doing on the ground planning, local planning? How can we make it more accessible for them? And of course, we're always thinking, like, what are other uses for this, right? We're always trying to come up with, new ways that this data can be used or ways that we can enhance the tool. So I just wanted to run through a couple of those pretty quickly, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. But one of the examples that I wanted to point out, right, is really like on a super simple and visual basis. You can use the outputs from these HRU layers for heat mapping. So you can, rather than mapping the HRU class themselves, you can map either the runoff generation or the associated loading of whatever it may be. In this case, it's phosphorus. And you can just look at it and say, okay, well, I'm looking at runoff. Red means more than orange, more than yellow. Getting a lot of it from our roads, right? And this is a case study that is that's described in our HRU story map that we covered in our first webinar. And that's maybe not surprising, right? Impervious cover roads get a lot of runoff from them. But it gets a little more interesting when you look at the phosphorus and you see that the roads are not all the same when it comes to phosphorus loading. And this is where the HRU layer is really powerful because we all know impervious surfaces increase runoff, increase nutrient loading, but it really matters what's going on around those impervious surfaces. Are we talking about a road, like a lightly trafficked road in the middle of a forest, versus a 4-6 lane road that's in an industrially zoned area? They're probably going to behave different, and HRUs start to get at that and start to provide a little bit more information about how you might want to approach your planning or how you might want to prioritize projects. This is another example, and this came out of the project that introduced me to hydrologic response units and just like the whole concept of them, which was done by EPA in Tisbury on Martha's Vineyard. And they looked at HRUs and associated runoff and nutrient loading by zoning district. And I thought this was really interesting because you can see that you can look at sort of, and I don't know what differences between these districts. I don't know any of those, but what I looked at was you can see that even among those residential districts that are the at the top of the graph, the nitrogen and the runoff don't track by area. And so this is where things can get interesting. As you might know, we have a lot of residential, maybe we have a lot of different types of residential, or maybe we have very little residential and a lot of commercial. I think we may have ideas about where runoff and where nutrients are coming from. And these HRUs can help you figure out whether those ideas or impressions are accurate or, whether you can get kind of some interesting, interesting distributions that maybe don't match with our impressions. So that was one way it could be looked at. We took our Cape Cod HRU layer and we started to look at it just by generalized zoning. And this was kind of an interesting result for both of those reasons, which was, okay, this is a town on Cape Cod. Most of it is zoned residential. And you see most of the acreage residential, most of the runoff residential. And maybe, maybe that's to be expected because that's the majority of your land use. But if you look kind of inside the smaller piece of the pie, you see that there's a lot, a pretty significant chunk of conservation, passive recreation acreage, uh, and smaller proportions of like the general business, limited business, light industrial. But if you look at the runoff graph on the right, that conservation land, very little runoff, right? Whereas those business and industrial zones contribute a lot more. So again, maybe not super surprising, but interesting to kind of be able to put some numbers to it. And so, those are sort of like neat things that seem interesting to explore. But again, we want to hear from you all. Like now that you've seen maybe some examples, you've seen all these other webinars, you know that there's a resource that should be available shortly outside just Cape Cod and what we've done, but for the rest of the SNEP region. Like, do you have any ideas about a way that you'd like to slice this data up? Do you want to look at it by neighborhood? Does topography matter where you are? Do you want to look at political boundaries? Do you want to look at open space? Are you looking for low runoff areas that maybe don't have permanent protection? Is this a way that you can prioritize, land acquisition and protection? These are all kind of ideas that we spitballed to hopefully, spark maybe some thoughts. And we hope that you'll throw any any additional ideas here or thoughts or questions into the Q&A. And that's my last slide. So we will I think kick it back to Leah and see what we've got.
Yes, thanks, Tim and Tara. We do have some questions, and feel free, we do have time for Q&A. So if you haven't asked your question yet, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel. For the first question we have, what is the unit measurement for runoff? It says inches per year, but is that a volume measurement?
Yeah, so the inches per year is basically the loading rate. So in terms of volume for us, it's that inches per year times 100 square meters. So because we used a 10 by 10 grid cell, if you kind of go to outside of that grid cell paradigm, then it has, you have to select a unit of area on which you're kind of doing that calculation. So it does ultimately get to a volume number. And I believe that the outputs from the stormwater impacts calculator should be in terms of volume because they're based on that 10 by 10 grid cell. But that is kind of a tricky conversion that does have to happen to get from those loading rates to an actual volume or to an actual kind of pounds per year mass.
Yeah, if you notice in some of Tim's later slides showing the stormwater impacts, the runoff was reported in cubic feet per year. So I think that is a volume measurement.
We do have another question in the Q&A box. Have you considered adding modified HRU export coefficients that reflect the application of specific BMPs? Mark Voorhees, before retiring from EPA Region 1, had done this work that would support that effort.
Yeah, so we haven't looked into that as part of our tool for sure. I know that's like very obviously the kind of other side to this is sort of this is the baseline starting with what's generated, and then the other side is how can you change what's generated through BMPs, through different types of land management. So definitely a kind of item for future work, and whether that's something that we, SNEP Network and the Cape Cod Commission specifically will work on, or whether that's something that, will be part of larger discussions with EPA and SNEP and kind of rolling in, right, like other tools that exist already, like the Opti tool, those sorts of things. Much bigger discussion, but definitely something that's already on the radar, and certainly will be moving forward.
I don't see any other questions yet in the chat, but we do have time, so please feel free to add questions into the Q&A box. I think this time, Tara, do you want to remind folks? I saw you dropped a link in the chat, just where people can access the tool.
Yeah. Right. So I put a link in the chat, and I think that's probably the easiest way to get to the stormwater impacts calculator or stormwater impacts tool. It is hosted on our Cape Cod Commission website, but I think navigating there from our homepage might be a little bit more difficult. So that link is probably the best way to get there.
And I'll be sure after this webinar to send a follow-up email with the recording, and as well as links such as that link. So you'll have it sent to your email as well. We did get another question come through. It says, does the model assume that pollutants are released at a rate proportional to the runoff rate, or are larger concentrations of pollutants released in the first flush, such as the first inch of rainfall during a storm?
Yeah, so I think that's a question for kind of the Opti tool and the SWIM, so the stormwater management model side of things. My understanding of it is that it is based on, right, so you're getting outputs in terms of per year. And so those loading rates and runoff volumes are based off of, I want to say, like a sort of 20-year simulation, but it is aggregated by year. So I'm not 100% positive, how the simulation builds in the actual release of pollutants when it is coming up with those annualized loading rates. But that is, I mean, it's a great question, right? And one of the really important pieces to to thinking about the actual like practical application of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another question. Assuming most of the Cape is sandy soils, would it be useful to add USDA soil survey data to determine suitability of soils for stormwater control measure installation?
Yeah, so I think we do include soil type. That is one of the layers that go into it, and I'm looking to our GIS folks to see if they recall how our soil data layer compares to the USDA one.
So we are using the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service soils.
Thanks, Deb. That's what I thought. Now, again, that's looking at soils kind of primarily as a driver of, does precipitation infiltrate into the soil versus running off overland, which is different from looking at it from a BMP suitability standpoint. But that said, all of that soil type information is kind of preserved within that HRU layer. So like the soil type doesn't go away when it gets classified as developed pervious. So it's all still there. And again, that would apply kind of on the other side of things when you're looking at either selecting management practices, or you have management practices and you want to kind of be able to model what their impacts are.
So next question was, will you send a recording to all that registered? Yes, the recording will go to everybody who has been registered, as well as the links, these important links. And we'll also take what you can, send us an email if you have questions that you thought of post webinar. We're happy to answer your questions offline as well. And I do not see any more questions in the chat. I don't know if Tim and Tara, you have any final thoughts here?
I mean, just to second what you said, Leah, is that certainly we encourage people to, go test drive this tool, even if it's not, even if you're not on Cape Cod. Anyone who wants to just try it out and see if there are things you like, if there are things you don't like, if there are things, that you would want to, if you had HRU data for your municipality, which if you're in the SNAP network, you will soon, ways that you would want to look at it, slice it, dice it, definitely reach out, to any one of us by email. Let us know, because even if it's something that we are not necessarily going to build into like the stormwater impacts tool, or we're not going to build a tool for that region, we're always trying to gather that information and figure out, if it's a larger regional tool or something, is it something that can be done at the SNEP program level? Is it something that the commission can kind of develop a workflow for, so that people who want to create their own version of it in another region have a blueprint for? Like, those are all things that we're constantly trying to do. But we really just, we're trying to get people using it so they can try it out and give us that feedback, so that we can continue over the next 5 years of SNEP network to to try and make it better and better accessible.
I would only add to that Tim and our perspective is very much water resource based. And so hearing from people who are, from other perspectives and how this information, what would be a good, like Tim's side, just the previous to the thank you slide, do you want to see this by neighborhood, by topography, political boundary, other resource areas, things that, didn't occur to us because of our perspective on what we do, day in, day out for our jobs. Any kind of suggestions would be very much welcome. So yeah, definitely reach out, send an email, or get in touch with one of us and give us any kind of insight you might have towards that.
On that note, thank you, Tim and Tara. And thank you everyone for attending. And we hope to see you next time. And please follow up if you have any other questions. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.